All right, well, tonight we are finally going to start our study on Esther. And so I needed a couple more weeks, so I needed one more week to get all my information I want to gather. So this is the introduction. And looking at the book of Esther, there's quite a bit. There's a lot more information than I thought I would get on the introduction. That's why I didn't think it would take too long. But there is a lot more to see with the book. You know, and it's a very unique book, and we're going to talk about that really at the end. But in the fact of that it's unique in that it's not mentioned in any other book. And no other book, no other verse mentions the book of Esther. And so it's very unique in that sense. Other things you could say is that God is not mentioned. Not one of the words used in the Old Testament for God is ever mentioned in the book. Now, there's a lot of theories on, I think there was one time someone said that you could find basically an acrostic in the book for God. I think that's a stretch. But as we're going to see, God is very present in the book of Esther, and you can see that, and we'll talk about that later, and how we can see that. But when we look at the date and the author of the book, we don't know. Now, we can pinpoint kind of the timeline of when this happened, of course, but to know when the book was actually written is hard to determine. It's stated it could have been written more than likely from 485 to 465 BC. And so it had to have been written during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire, or shortly after. So what was important about the Medo-Persian Empire? Do you guys remember about it? It's one of what? Okay, one of 4 nations that was talked about by Daniel, right? And Daniel talked about it quite a bit. Medo-Persia is represented as the bear that stood up, and it was Medo that went first. So the bear, as it came out of the water, had one leg. It came up on one leg and then the other. And so Media was the first leg, and then Persia was the other leg. And it was a great beast. And it conquered Lydia, it conquered Egypt, it conquered, I can't remember what the third kingdom was. Anyways, it conquered 3 kingdoms, and it did. And throughout history, we can see that. And so this happened during the time of the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, the date really depends upon who may have written the book. It could have been Ezra. What are some other books that Ezra wrote? There's one in particular, Ezra. That's the simple one. Ezra. Also, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. More than likely was Ezra also. And how it's written, a lot of people say, well, then it's very similar to Ezra's writing, so more than likely it was Ezra. So if it was Ezra, he was writing during this time of the accounts of Esther. Some say it could have been Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah wrote the book of Nehemiah, but he was also writing during this time. And so it falls within that period, because you think about the first, I didn't write down a timeline here. I have a timeline of the departures, or back into going out of captivity. Cyrus was the first king to allow the Israelites to go back home. And he, the man that's going to be in this Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, we're going to talk about that, he came later. And so this would have been after the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, and rebuilding of the temple, rebuilding of the walls. And so it would have happened in that period of time. So it could have been Nehemiah. The third thought is it could have been Mordecai. Now, who is Mordecai? Esther's, or cousin, or we'll get that. I think it's cousin. It could have been Mordecai. And there's some ideas with that, and the fact that there was written conversations that Esther had with Mordecai. But as we've seen with the New Testament, I mean, just because of a person not being there doesn't matter. Being inspired, God gave them the message, and so here it could have been Mordecai. So I'm going to read Esther 9:20 through 23.
Moses wrote Genesis, and that was hundreds of years before his life. So you said, maybe some obscure prophet.
Yeah, it could be. We don't know. There's more than just one book of the Bible that we don't know exactly who wrote it. It doesn't matter, but we'll see. Somebody read that, Esther 9:20 through 23. All right, so here Mordecai, when the decree went out, who wrote it? He did. So more than likely, he wrote the decree that went out. He could have also wrote down this account of what had happened. It was definitely written with some Persian type language. There was another name for it, but it was basically a mix of Hebrew and Persian. And there were some words that in the book, I didn't get that written down, it was just in some of my study. There was some words that's used in the book of Esther that were those type of words. And so it was definitely someone who was in part of the Persian Empire, being there firsthand, which would have been really any of them, but different prophets wrote from different areas, depending on where they're at. Like Jeremiah, he was back at home writing. And so it could have been Mordecai, we don't know. It doesn't really matter. In the fact of, it's just interesting to speculate on who could have been. But so the date could have been roughly 485, 465 BC, which is really during the time of the reign of Ahasuerus. And so the setting of the book was during the time of Ahasuerus. Now, with excavation of a lot of things that from this time, from Persia, this name was also used by more than one person. We've talked about this with Pharaoh. How many times was the name Pharaoh used by different men? It was a name for the king, basically. We see that with other kings also. So Ahasuerus was also a name that was used by other people, other kings during that time, or in that period of 400 to 300 some BC. But it is definitely believed by many people, many scholars, that this Ahasuerus was actually Xerxes. And so here's a quote. It says, excavations from Persepolis have demonstrated that the name, or rather the title Ahasuerus, is used by at least 3 or 4 Persian kings. Here, beyond a reasonable doubt, it is a reference to Xerxes II, 486 to 465, the oldest son of Darius. And so another name for Ahasuerus was Xerxes. And Xerxes, as I said, reigned from that period of time. This was Esther's husband. And he's mentioned, we're going to read all those, but it's mentioned several times who this man was. Esther 1 and verse 1, it says, now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus. This was Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. That's why it's somewhat easy to pick who this was, and that this was Xerxes. He was over 127 different provinces from India. That's a pretty big span of area. If you remember back, Alexander the Great, he went to India and captured a lot of area there until his men got they basically got burned out and said, oh, we want to go home. But when Medo-Persia came in, well, Medo-Persia was first, but that same area he went and captured. He was trying to capture all of Persia Empire, and that was a part of India. He attacked Greece with what Herodotus described as 5 million Persians. It was believed that when Xerxes went to, he had a thing for Greece. He wanted to kill Greece. He wanted to capture Greece, all costs. And so he spent several years preparing for that battle to go into Greece. And of course, his going through Greece down to Athens, to capture Athens, he went through across the Hellespont, he went through Macedonia, and every time he would fight, he would go through Macedonia. Well, who was from Macedonia we talked about later on? Alexander the Great. And upset him, so Alexander, for revenge, wanted to destroy all of Persia. And so Xerxes, is the person who upset Alexander. He is the one that went into this area and caused this, this fight that went on for a long time. And so to get into Greece with 5 million Persians, he had a bridge made across the Hellespont. And the reason we're talking about this is it's important for some of the things we're going to see in Esther. But he made a bridge across the Hellespont there. Well, this area is known for a lot of storms. And if you go into, we've talked about Herodotus before. In his histories, he had this quote. He said, when Xerxes heard of it, and this is this great storm destroying this bridge that he had made by some men, he was full of wrath, and straightway gave orders that the Hellespont should receive 300 lashes, and that a pair of fetters should be cast into it. Nay, I have even heard it said that he bade the branders take their irons and therefore brand the Hellespont. He is certain that he commanded those who scourge the waters to utter as they lashed them these barbarian and wicked words. Thou bitter water, thy Lord lays on thee this punishment, because thou hast wronged him with a cause, having suffered no evil at his hands. Verily, King Xerxes will cross thee, whether thou wilt or not. Well, thou dost deserve that no man should honor thee with sacrifice, for thou art a truth of treacherous and savory river. While the sea was thus punished by his orders, he likewise commanded the overseers of the work to lose their heads. So we're getting a picture of Xerxes here is what we're doing. He was a man who was very extreme in both ways. He could go very extreme in one way, he could go very extreme in the other way. And we're going to see that with the queen. And that's where it come about with Esther. And we're also going to see that with his decrees. He's going to kill all the Jews one day, and then the next day he's not going to. And so we're seeing kind of this character here. So he's someone who would just go crazy. I mean, who would order lashes on a body of water and think that's going to do something? Now, you think about it in their thinking, they believed, there was different gods that ruled different areas, right? And so, in a sense, he's thinking that he's punishing the god of this river, the Hellespont, with doing this, and he thought that it was going to make an advantage for him. He did end up remaking that bridge and marched across and ultimately found his demise because basically the Spartans took him out. Well, he fought them and ended up going back home. But at Thermopylae, Xerxes opposed a Spartan force led by Leonidas, while a victor of sorts, 20,000 Persians were killed by a 300 Spartan force that fought to death to the last man. And so if you know the stories of the 300 Spartans that stood against Xerxes, that was Esther's husband that did this. And he had he had 5 million soldiers, so it didn't bother him. He wanted them dead. He wanted to get through their area and get to Athens. Xerxes lost 2 brothers in this battle. Ultimately, Xerxes, after he left, his great general, Mardonius, was defeated at the sea by a cunning, I'm not going to say his name, and on this mountain, on the land, in 479 BC. So he was defeated. No Persian after him would ever cross the Hellespont to fight Greece again. It ended up, which this would be after the book of Esther, but he come back very upset and very ashamed of losing that battle in Greece. And no one ever crossed the Hellespont again as a Persian. The setting of chapter 1 would have been a feast he had before marching to Greece. So he spent a lot of time preparing for this fight to go into Greece. And it is said that he took people from every inch of his empire, which went down from Egypt all the way to India. He took people from every inch of his empire, gathered them together to go to Greece because he wanted to kill them so bad and conquer their area. And so it is believed that chapter 1, where this feast that he has, is in that preparation for that march to Greece. Some believe that chapter 2 is after he came back. I don't think that's the case. I think it's more of after the book of Esther is when he actually made the charge into Greece and came back. And so the setting of the book was in Susan in Persia. The Persian Empire at its strength controlled land east to the Indus River, which was India, northeast to the Aral Sea, north to the Caucasus Mountain Range, northwest to Macedonia, southwest into Libya, and south to the border of Ethiopia. So it was a pretty big, I don't think we have a map talking about that. I know I've seen several. I think this is just the Bible ones. Yeah, that one kind of shows it. So here's Israel, and this is the Mesopotamian area. So this is the track of Abraham from Chaldees up through. But Media was up in here, and Persia was down here. And so this area he captured all across there, all through here, and all the way back, even more there. So that's a pretty good sized empire that he had. The culture. The Persians were ethnically similar to the Medes, as being from a mountainous region. They were very close to one another. Somebody read Daniel chapter 6 and verse 8. Okay, so they had a law that was not altered, and that's important because once he made the decree, as we're going to see in the book of Esther, which for the Jews to be killed, he could not change it. And also with the unaltered law, that's important when it comes to their addition to the coming of Christ. The law of Christ is not altered, doesn't change. And so we see that importance there that was brought into the church today, and their significance to that. I did skip over a part there. Sorry. Let's go back for a second. So a look into his character and personality. Let's see. It says a quote, "This is a king who dishonored the remains of heroic Spartan Leonidas. This is the king who drowned the humiliation of his inglorious defeat in such a plunge of sensuality that he publicly offered a prize for the inventage of some new indulgence." Herodotus tells us that among the Marides gathered for the expedition against Greece, Ahasuerus was the fairest in personal beauty and stately bearing. But morally he was a mixture of passionate extremes. He is just the despot to dethrone Queen Vashti for refusing to expose herself before his guests. He is just the one to consign a people like the Jews to be massacred, and then to swing over to the opposite extreme of sanctioning Jewish vengeance on thousands of his other subjects. And so we're just setting up a character and personality for Xerxes here and seeing why things happened the way they did. And really, when you think about when Esther is going to go and stand before Xerxes, why she could have easily lost her life. Because he could have liked Esther one day, and the next day he could have been, I don't like her, I want her gone, and had her killed. So, you would think a normal person would not act in the way, in the extremes that he did, but he did. And so it kind of puts more of a understanding on the things that happened of chapter 1 and chapter 2, and Esther getting to the point where she was at, and also her fear. And so learning more about him, his characteristics. So, any questions on that? I know I'm just reading a lot here. Hopefully it's interesting. I like history. You guys know that. All right, we'll move on. And so, like I said, this is in the area of Persia, the importance of the unaltered law, which Daniel talked about. And we'll see that in the book of Esther also. And so Persia, a vassal people under Media, would soon create one of the great empires of the world, the Medo-Persian religion. So I'm going to read Daniel chapter 2, verse 32 and verse 39.
This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass. And after thee shall arise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, which shall bear rule over all the earth.
All right, so it talks about Medo-Persia in one of the 4 kingdoms in Daniel's image there. And it is a very powerful nation, but it was not as glorious as Babylon, which was the head of gold. It was not as important in a sense as Babylon was. But it was a kingdom that was talked about, and that's the time of Esther. And so the audience of the book, so some of these things come from an introduction to Esther from Brother Cates, some things we talked about. But the audience of the book was written for the Israelites. So the purpose, it was to show God's providential care. That's one thing that we'll see throughout this book. Yes, God is not mentioned at all in this book, but what do we see is his providential care. Think about it. What would have happened if the decree for all of the Jews to be slain had actually went through? What could have been the outcome of that? Besides all of them dying. No seed. The lineage of Christ, Israel, would have ended. And so in a way, some read commentators on this, they'll say, well, Esther is really an account of God versus Satan, which I never really like saying that as God versus Satan, because God always wins. Satan is not anywhere on the spectrum of God. But I can see it in the sense of Satan trying to, at another point in history, try to stop the lineage of Christ from happening. And so we're seeing God's providential care happening in this book quite a bit. So even though God's not mentioned, we see that. God shows us his preservation of the seed of Abraham leading to Christ. Another purpose is the Jews, after being put in captivity, they finally received the peace God promised. You think about this point in history. It is after they have already been allowed to start going home. They have rebuilt the temple. They are building up of Jerusalem. If you remember in some of your Bible history, what was one of the things that the people had to do while they're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem? It was said that they would have a hammer in one hand, or a tool in one hand, and they would have a sword in the other hand. Because even though they were allowed to go back, even though they were allowed to rebuild the city, they were still fearful of their life. And so somebody read Jeremiah 29, verse 4 through 7.
Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all who were carried away captive, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and dwell in them, plant gardens and eat their fruit, take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters, that you may be increased there and not diminished, and seek the peace of the city where I have caused you to be carried away captive, and pray to the Lord for it, for in its peace you will have peace.
Okay, so chapter 29 and chapter 30, I think 31 also, really in Jeremiah focus on that return, focus on that peace that God has said would come to Israel when they go back from their captivity. And so you think about having this decree that's going to be, I know we're giving a lot of spoilers of the book of Esther, but I think most of us have read through Esther. But when you have this decree go out that no Jew should be killed, that they could defend themselves, it really sealed the deal from that point forward for Israel, that they would have peace. They would not have to worry about losing their life, because if someone tried to kill them, they could then defend themselves, and rightly so, by the king of Persia. They would be allowed to kill that person to defend themselves. And so that peace that God promised, you can really see that helped that peace to come for them, to the point where it's described as the children being able to play in the streets again without having to worry. And I think that's another purpose of this book that we can see. And the last one is the Feast of Purim. Somebody read Esther 8 and verse 17 to start with.
And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them.
Okay, and then chapter 9, verse 29 through 32.
Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book.
All right, so with the law of Moses, we do not read about any Feast of Purim at all. But when you get into the New Testament times, you see the Jews are celebrating this Feast of Purim. Where does it come from? Well, this is where it comes from, in the accounts that are the events that are found in Esther. And so it gives us some insight into that, and really that Feast of Purim that was celebrated later on in Israel's history, they would read this book. And that helps us in the sense of authenticity. When we think about the authenticity of this book, it was widely accepted as canonical, that it was canon to the Bible because Israel accepted it for many, many years as being canon. And that's one way that can help us to see that it is authentic, or it's authenticity. And so those are some of the purposes that we can find in the book. Some of the key words, decree, request, we'll see that used several times throughout the book. Key verses, chapter 4 and verse 11, that's really a key point in the book, is that point where Esther was not killed, but she was allowed to speak before the king. And then chapter 4 and verse 16 with her courage. So I'm going to read chapter 4 and verse 14. really, I think that's probably one of the most key verses of the book right there, is in chapter 4 and verse 14, because Mordecai is saying, how do you not know that this point was made, for you to be able to, we're put here for a time as this. But also it works to see God's work providentially, and the fact that if she wasn't the one to do it, there would be another way for God's people to be protected. Now, God's not mentioned, but we can see that providential care is there. We can also see a key lesson from this book would be the willingness to sacrifice self to serve God. In several different passages in the New Testament, but that's really 4 and verse 16 is her courage shows us that she was willing to sacrifice to be able to do what she needed to do in serving God, and she had the courage to do it. And then ultimately, wicked will fail, right? Chapter 7 and verse 10, that's with Haman being killed. And so ultimately being hung upon the gallows that he made. And so we can see some of those key lessons from the book there. We're out of time. We're about done with the introduction. But we'll finish this up next week. Anybody got any questions or comments? I know it's a lot of information, but it gives you a lot of information you can go back and look over. And before we get into the book, it just helps get us a better understanding and overview of the book before we start. Are there any questions or comments? All right, thank you guys.
I just thought it was a love story. I was like, why is this even in there?
Oh, yeah.
I already had that thought.
You already had that thought?
Nobody wants to claim who wrote it.
No one wants to claim it, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a love story in a sense, but really it's more of a providential care for you to see. If you want to talk about a love story, go to Songs of Solomon.
It has to do with prophecy too, though, doesn't it?
What do you mean by that?
By fulfilling of the prophecy by keeping the Jews alive.
Yeah, it really definitely does. That's one of the things we see there. Because if they had died, Christ would not have came through the lineage of Abraham. So, for sure. So, all right, thank you guys.
Extra one.